lot of time to pay homage to the tradition of economic jokes. I did want to feature one of the jokes, and that is a truly touching sentiment about economists. Economic forecasters assume everything except responsibility, which is a perfect introduction to our content today, which is about forecasting the future. A very interesting time where we are seeing massive technological change, what is potentially massive financial change as well, that could fundamentally turn on its head the history of automobile ownership from being a personal thing to something that's more fleet-owned. And we've got participants in that space that will help us understand that. But also at the crux of this is a major technological change to electrification. And so I wanted to set out today with some facts that everybody would be kind of level set in the room with some of the opportunities, some of the plans, some of the challenges that are upon the auto business as it relates to electric vehicles in particular. So these 12 things, and we'll have this presentation posted to the club website if any of you want the slides later. But 3 are a refresh if you were at our meeting last year, simply updated because I think it's appropriate for you to understand the context when we talk about new vehicle sales and specifically new electric vehicle sales. The industry is one that is actually dominated by used vehicles. In a typical year, about 70% of the transactions between consumers in the United States or between dealers and consumers or companies and consumers are dominated by used vehicle sales. And the new vehicle market makes up approximately 30% of that. Last year we had 17.2 million new vehicles sold in the United States. This year we're trending at 16.9. We believe we'll end somewhere between 16.8 and 17 million. The other thing to recognize with this industry, and I came into auto real estate, so my entire career has been spent trying to correctly identify cycles. This is indeed a cyclical business, and it's important to understand what the cycle does to the industry and to understand that based on the historic evidence, we are clearly in the post-peak part of the cycle, meaning that we are talking about a market that is reflective of the economic cycle, and being in the post-peak part of the cycle, betting on more new vehicle sales over the next couple of years is a tough bet to make. Perhaps you will. It'll be different this time, but I certainly wouldn't take that path. It's much more likely that we are going to be trending towards 16 million rather than the 18 million we briefly touched just a few years ago in terms of the new vehicle SAR. And this market, also an update on what we shared with you last year, is an amazingly diverse market in terms of the types of vehicles that are sold. We have gone through a massive change in consumer preference, and I would argue producer preference, away from smaller, more affordable sedans into larger light trucks, specifically sport utility vehicles, but actually one of the key changes happening in 2019 is an increasing share of full-size pickup trucks as well. So the focus of our conversation today is the electric vehicle, which represents 1% of the new vehicle sales in 2018. It is trending towards a little bit higher share, but you can see the diversity and the slice of the pie that the electric vehicle takes. But then if you look at the trends in that, actually one definitional thing is what is an electric vehicle? Because technically the industry calls 3 different things electric vehicles. One represented by that maroon line up at the top is hybrid electric vehicles. These are vehicles that have both a combustion engine as well as electric vehicle and typically don't have a pure electric vehicle mode. That was the largest part of the market several years ago, but started to shrink in share as alternative true electric, battery electric vehicles started to ramp up. But actually we've seen a renewed growth in those hybrid vehicles too. The green represents the electric purely related to the battery. So this is where Tesla's growth is landing. This is where we'll hear about Porsche's offering in this space. And that's where the growth nationally has been happening. And then we also have plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. These are unlike the hybrid at the top, that these actually have to be plugged in to charge the battery as opposed to getting the battery charged from the actual combustion engine, but they too also have a combustion engine. Think of this if you're familiar with the Chevy Volt, but that's also a vehicle that's been discontinued, and that's really a part of the market that's not expected to grow substantially going forward today. Now, an interesting contrast is to say what happens here in Georgia. And Georgia, in fact, is a testament to what happens when you have big incentives and what happens when those incentives go away. Georgia was actually the second leading state in the country for a while in electric vehicle sales, but then the state tax credit that was available fundamentally changed things in the marketplace, and you can see how that behaviorally worked out in terms of the battery electric vehicle share. The EV market here has been rebounding, or at least it was in 2018. So far in 2019, year to date, the true battery electric share is down just a little bit, but the hybrid part of the market is recovering just like we're seeing nationally. And most important in terms of where we're going as an industry, because of a factor of things, but most of them being fighting climate change and looking for an answer that is allowing many countries and in some cases states as well to set targets that by a certain point in time they will be 100% electric. The projections are for the industry to be dominated by EVs in terms of new production and what is sold by the year 2038. When you drill into the data, I like to keep a shorter horizon that maybe is a little bit more understandable. In 2025, so just a little over 5 years from now, the global share of EVs is expected to be 11% in that time. So you can understand the curve then, that between then and 2038, we are approaching more than 50% electric. The U.S. is following a slower curve. In that same data, by 2025, the U.S. is only projected to be about 6% electric. So what's happening in the U.S. is definitely at a slower pace than what we see globally. And then by definition, it means many countries are really leading the way in terms of this path to electric adoption. But when you look at it month to month, and it's really been a testament to the success that Tesla has had in its growth since the Model 3 was announced and introduced over the last 2 years, we've really started to see more share taking place month to month in what we see in the sales data. Now, I decided to show you a different kind of map. If I showed you a map of where the EV sales are in the country, it becomes a very boring map because it's basically California and everyone else. So instead, I decided, well, what has year-to-date been happening in 2019 relative to where we were same time in 2018, and how is the share trending in terms of EV sales within individual states? And actually, California is losing share in terms of their market. They seem to have reached a point of saturation that the EV vehicles, in terms of their percentage of the market, is no longer growing as it once was. And instead, you start to see states like Texas and portions of the Mid-Atlantic really being the states where we're seeing higher penetration in terms of the share of the market and what's happening compared to just last year. But there's also a geographic dimension to electric vehicles that is very much an urban phenomenon. And our state map, looking at the zip codes of where electric vehicles are selling in the United States, and specifically in Georgia in 2019, it's all about the Atlanta metro area. And I think this is going to be definitely related to the infrastructure topic that we'll talk about today. And as you might guess, there is a demographic factor that plays as well in electric vehicles. New vehicles, by their nature, by their price, skew naturally to higher income and actually older households. The key difference that we see with electric vehicles is that the age demographic skews younger for electric vehicles relative to what we see for new vehicles in total. But demographics definitely play a role in terms of the products that have been introduced to date, who can afford those products. And when you combine that with the geography and the incentives, you can start to understand why we don't have consistent adoption from market to market, state to state, or even zip code to zip code. Now, much has been said, and I think we're going to talk about it today, that one of the factors holding back consumers in this space has been what's called range anxiety. The perception is we need to get to a level that roughly is the equivalent of what we're all accustomed to, of filling up a combustible engine vehicle and being able to drive roughly 300 to 400 miles without having to to refill. That sort of distance potentially is going to be necessary. And so what we've got on this is an interesting range of what you can see exists today, with a range of an average across all offerings of 230 miles for a battery electric vehicle, to one that we will potentially be approaching 500 miles in just a few years' time. So that range issue, because of advancements in technology, is definitely one that is starting to fall within that range, that potentially range anxiety is not the number one issue for most consumers in adoption. But yet, when we survey consumers, and the Kelley Blue Book part of Cox Automotive basically quarterly is analyzing data about consumers and their preferences towards different kinds of vehicles and what are they intending to buy. What we basically see is that consumers believe that electric vehicles are going to be all over the road, and that really is not changing over the time. However, it seems to be that consumers believe that everyone else is going to be driving electric vehicles, but not me, because they're going to represent 70% of the vehicles that we see on the road in the near future, in the next 5 years. However, when we explicitly ask them what type of vehicle are you considering, only 3 to 4% consistently have been considering electric vehicles. And much of that consideration, especially over the last 3 years, has been Tesla. So you remove Tesla from the equation, and the consideration is really not coming close to that 70% target, which also, for an economist like me, makes me say, well, wait a minute, we're going to be 10% in 5 years, and we're going to be 50% globally in 25 years. It really makes you think, when is the consumer going to wake up to that? And so when we most recently did research and we looked at the people who said they wouldn't consider electric vehicles and what are the things that are really holding them back, two things really jumped to the top. Number one was cost. And when you think about electric vehicles, the price that we had earlier, I would argue, is an average price and is kind of missing the fact that you have the Nissan Leaf and then you have Tesla. And so there really isn't an average electric vehicle that kind of fits that price that's up there. But it's definitely something that in terms of the average vehicle, an electric vehicle, compared to its combustible engine type peer, is a much more expensive vehicle because of the cost of the battery, but also the cost of the kind of offerings that have been more luxury oriented, especially in what Tesla has had success with. And then the second factor, and even more important to cost, is charging, and the concern about the battery and how the battery is going to perform over time. And that's certainly one where the manufacturers cannot solve the charging question. That's one that's going to take a village in terms of local governments, utility companies, you name it, in terms of us getting to a place that we have anything close to what we have with gas stations today supporting the combustible engines that we have in the marketplace. So that's the context. Those are the dozen facts that I wanted you to ponder and think about as we get into our panel. And now, without further ado, I would like to invite our esteemed guests up. So everybody can come up and take a comfortable seat up here with me.